negotiating between applied cooling practices and chronic urban heat among thermally vulnerable urban populations in the global south.
Hello, everyone. My name is Soha and I'm presenting on coding compromises. I've co-authored this piece with Dr. Adam Abdullah, who is my colleague. We're both associate directors at the Karachi Urban Lab, which is a small research institute based within Karachi, Pakistan. Now, I'm an architect and a planner. I'm not a climate scientist by any measure. And our purpose of exploration was essentially to find out how thermally vulnerable urban populations negotiate and substitute different kind of tacit and applied cooling practices in chronically exposed cities. And we take the southern city of Karachi as a proxy for other cities that are facing similar issues. And we extend upon a conceptual model to understand that what are the kind of cooling materials, cooling cuisines, or cooling routines that act as improvisations or stand in when certain kind of infrastructures that are infrastructure dependent cooling technologies become unreliable or unavailable for these populations. The research is part of a broader project on cool infrastructures like the Green the Operate City, which is funded by GCRF. Just to give a little bit of context of Karachi, South Asia is known to be vulnerable to heat stress, and Sindh, which is the southernmost province of Pakistan, is considered a hotspot for climate change. Pakistan is also the fifth most vulnerable country according to the Climate Risk Index, and there have been a series of climate disasters that the country has been facing over the last few years. Its largest city is Karachi, with an unofficial population of 25 million, and one of the deadliest heat waves that was experienced was in June 2015, where official figures suggested that 1,200 people died, but unofficial estimates say that anywhere between 3,000 to 6,000 people lost their lives in this heat wave. The climate of Karachi is considered as low altitude, hot, arid, and subtropical, but the humidity level is very high. One thing that we face in Karachi is an absolute lack of data. We have no data available. For a city this huge, there's only two weather stations that exist. One, which is publicly accessible data, which is at the airport, and the other is at a military station, so it's not accessible. Our first step was to purchase the data from the Met Department, and we got the annual temperatures for the last 60 years and annual daily temperatures as well. And what we found that daytime temperatures have increased over 1.6 degrees in the last 60 years, while nighttime temperature has increased by 2.4. So of course, this is representative of the urban heat island effect that the city is facing. As a next step, we've also purchased humidity data, and we will be calculating the heat index for the city. Of course, what all of this temperature change means is that those who are already vulnerable population are going to be facing the brunt of this climate change. And that's important because in Karachi, over 62% of the population lives in informal settlements, which comprise only 9% of the urbanized land. So these are very high densities, and people living on very compact lands, and the infrastructure is not only inequitable, but also in most cases unavailable. So active cooling becomes difficult when these infrastructures are either unavailable, unpredictable, or unaffordable. The question then is, how do these populations navigate heat in their everyday lives? These are the general built conditions, which are high density, high rises, not high rises, mid rises, but when the lanes are as narrow as 3 to 4 feet, the kind of impact this had on the ventilation, which is inside these houses, becomes a key point of concern. The city is unequal, and so the heat is also experienced unequally. The thermal experiences are not captured. There is no data on microclimate that exists. So our second step was that we purchased weather stations, and we've installed over 15 weather stations in different parts of the city to be able to collect microclimatic data and then to understand how it is affected by topography and the different conditions that exist in the city. For the methodology, in the summer 2022, we conducted extensive fieldworks. As I said again, data is just not available. There's no data on thermal experiences, building densities, building materials, or any of those parameters. So we did 13,000 surveys across 50 low-income informal settlements. We did in-depth interviews, focus groups, and some heat measurement equipment in the form of weather stations, as I discussed, heat stress monitors, hygrometers, thermal cameras, which we took on field with us to collect all of this information. Just to give a little bit of an idea, these were the study sites of the 50 informal settlements. So they're spread throughout the city and fairly a representative sample in that way. What we find is that people's everyday modulation tactics revolve around taking cool showers, wetting cement floors, wetting their clothes and standing in front of fans, all of which are very much dependent on water and electricity availability, upon which they also change their daily rhythms and activities such as cooking and laundry. Now, what happens when these infrastructures of ventilation and hydration are unaffordable, unpredictable, or unreliable? 96% of this population, as we found out from our sample size, does not own air conditioners. Over 70% reported that they've experienced 6 hours of power breakdowns every day, and over 71% have no backup power. So they rely on either changing the temporal and spatial routines by changing the space that they occupy or altering the activities that they're conducting, changing the materiality of their clothing or their surrounding by adding shade, or changing the kind of food and drinks that they consume in order to deal with that heat. However, this is not without certain compromises. Now, we've talked about these being the more socioeconomically vulnerable populations in the city. And sometimes they're making these compromises even when it comes to heat adaptation. This would involve reserving cold drinks or groceries for guests, rationing out the kind of syrups or cold drink intake that their children are going to be doing. Decisions of whether to turn the air conditioner on, which is in those rare instances, or even the fan are based upon issues of affordability and also peak billing timing. So in the city, there is different timings when electricity pricing is adjusted, and mostly it is the hotter hours when peak billing timings are higher. So people are also kind of forced to make these negotiations of whether it is hot enough to turn the fan on even. And also certain kind of, opting for certain kind of food that would require less time spent in the kitchen, but at the same time, issues of affordability means that they cannot buy, say, ready-made bread instead, while they have to stand and cook it at the stove. Now, one thing that does is that it is essentially the female population who bears the burden of cooking and all of these daily chores, essentially. And they are confined in the indoors for the longest period of time. Our sample suggests that 1/5 of the respondents spent 24 hours inside their home, and 77% of these were women. These women, as they occupy hot kitchens, stand near the stove, and temperature suggests that the indoor temperatures are 38.7. So it's not much cooler than the outdoors. Heat advisory warnings, even during heat waves, suggest that people should stay indoors. But indoor environments in these houses are as high as 38.7, made worse by the built material conditions of these houses. They may have tin roofs, which are absorbing heat at a greater rate. And so it results in bodily harm, which is gendered, spatial, and embodied. And some of these are intended compromises. So for instance, in spite of knowing the ventilation pattern or the direction of the wind, people may build rooms in that path due to the changing needs of the family or for privacy concerns. Sometimes these are unintended compromises. For instance, in 2020, there was a different kind of climate disaster that the city experienced, which was urban flooding. And a lot of these houses that were located along river channels were flooded. And so spaces that were initially built on the ground floor now had to be accommodated on the first floor, and there were makeshift kitchens and ventilation and kind of any sort of consideration that was initially even given while making the house were now lost, and these interior spaces were getting warmer because of these added walls inside the room. There's also certain kind of compromises that are made between risks, certain other risks that are taken upon, and I'm going to quote one of our respondents over here. I cannot take the heat at all, which is why I usually sleep upstairs on the open roof. If I go upstairs, the mosquitoes bother me. If I stay downstairs, the heat is unbearable. When I cannot sleep at all, I take sleeping pills. At least I would not be awake if the mosquito bites me. So there's a different kind of harm that is taken upon the body in order to avoid the hot spaces that are inside the house. Now, another thing that we found was people, as I said, were compromising on the number of showers they take or the water they consume. But this was more of a perceptual compromise because from the data that we got, there was no significant correlation between the household expenses per capita and the household water expenditure. So people were taking this further harm upon themselves without an actual impact on the socioeconomic decision that they thought was being affected. There's gender compromises, so even though there are some kind of open spaces like courtyards that exist in the house, social and patriarchal norms not only prevent women from going outdoors, but even open spaces within the house are not permitted to be used by younger females because of privacy concerns that other people from the neighbor's house can see them. And so it's a specific kind of gender term that is happening. We're also, again, this is all very preliminary. We're kind of understanding what kind of correlations we can make in the data that we've acquired. So we're also intending to look at the amount of time that these women spend at home and also the thermal comfort that they perceive. And that would also help us understand what other compromises are made. Another one that we find is greening compromises. So initially, while these neighborhoods did have a lot of plantation, over time, because of the needs of expanding persons per household, all of these trees were cut down, and there is no longer any greenery in the neighborhoods, not only in and around the house, but also in the surrounding area. And so people who had outdoor spaces as respite no longer have that. 88% of our respondents have reported no indoor or outdoor plants or greenery around their house. Now, what this means for conclusion, and first off, of course, we understand that these isolated practices are insufficient to fulfill thermal comfort needs. These are just us understanding what is happening on ground when it comes to adapting to heat in these already marginalized populations. And one thing that this does is that when any kind of prescriptive forms of urban heat management are given, they're mostly top-down and they do not understand or take into account the contextual and social-cultural realities that can impact the actual kind of good that is coming out of those prescriptions. So for instance, there is a cooling action plan that is under the works for Pakistan. But if it does not consider the kind of ground realities and say a cooling center is developed, which is not cognizant of the gendered aspects of the society, then women are not going to be able to access those cooling stations, and there's going to be a large section of the population deprived of the ability to adapt to heat as it is increasing. Similarly, heat officers, neighborhood parks, how does all of that, how does the data, how can all of this data help us better contribute to people's existing practices and how to link it together? And I learned a lot from this conference, and our aim is that the data that we're collecting, we are able to produce some kind of information that we then share with some of our stakeholders who are government representatives to be able to contribute better to this. Thank you.
Questions? Anyone who has not asked a question yet? You're good, you first.
Thank you for your presentation from the eyes of an architect. Just I was looking, if you look into the component of building also, how it plays a role in order to take care of the extreme heat.
Yes, absolutely. So in our survey, we included information that were gathered from the 13,000 surveys that we conducted of wall materials, roof materials, whether people have made any changes to their house, how many windows they have, how do they use those windows, are there transformations that have happened over time, and how have they impacted the thermal comfort that they experience. So that is all data that is collected, and we're still going through processing it.
Thanks.
Another question?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk, and it's a huge issue of climate justice and equity issues. I wonder, I mean, this is a fantastic survey results, but have you talked with your local government about the survey results? And if you did, what's their response?
Okay. Yes, so as I said that there was no study before this that kind of even looks at the temperature increases in the city. So when we did that study, we invited representatives of the local government to the seminar and we explained to them. So the understanding is everyone, heat is sort of in the background in climate disasters, at least in our case, despite the kind of deaths that have happened. Flooding, which is a more visible form of a disaster and which can result in a lot more foreign funding for that matter, because of its visibility and scale, gets a lot more traction, not only in the media, but also in government budgets. Heat has no component in the disaster budget that exists in the city. So we're still pushing for kind of the inclusion of heat, not only in the cooling action plans, but also in the master plan that is being developed for the city. And how can any of this information kind of contribute to that? Again, so for instance, one of those greening compromises led us to push, at least try to push, for having neighborhood greenery and greenery on more of a mesoscale as opposed to having these large tracts of green billion tree tsunamis. That is a kind of concept that has now been popularized, but the advantages of that greenery are not being received by the populations who are most in need of it. So this kind of data kind of helps us push for those things.
But worldwide, extreme heat
Yeah.
kills more people than any other weather
Yeah.
disaster.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe a quick short one. Quick from
Okay.
Dave.
Just speaking from the subcontinent perspective, I mean, you're probably seeing the Surat heat mitigation plan and so forth. I think a good strategy that seems to work is getting private organizations at a very local scale who have financial interest into the group and bringing up this heat plans, because those plans look like a low investment. People get invested in that process, and when the private sector gets involved, they have a means to generate funding because they unfortunately see profit, but that helps the general good. I wonder if that strategy is something that has been discussed and could still be a template going forward.
Yeah, so just two parts to that. There is a heat wave management plan that was created for Karachi, but again, and that was borrowed largely from the Ahmedabad Action Plan. But it prescribes people to stay indoors when it's hot. And it relies entirely on ambient temperatures to kind of make these deductions for when it's a heat wave. It does not consider humidity and its impacts on the thermal experiences. So those are kind of lackings that have taken place in our copying from other contexts. But the government has also, in its guise of not having the resources to deal with heat, transferred the responsibility to NGOs. So there's not private corporations or organizations that have played a part in this, but there are NGOs. However, those are also very temporally situated solutions. So when it's a heat wave announced, there is these heat wave camps that are set up, which are giving water and different kind of syrups to people. But as soon as the heat wave goes, so do these camps. It's not sustainable, and the scale of operations of these NGOs are not vast enough to do this on a long-term basis. So that's kind of where the state still needs to pitch in.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker again.